May 12, 1945 dawned gray and cold across the Bavarian countryside as a convoy of Allied trucks rumbled through the muddy roads toward Processing Camp 17. Inside the canvas-covered vehicles, 37 German women sat in exhausted silence, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty after weeks of chaotic retreat from the collapsing Eastern Front. Among them was Greta Mueller, a 24-year-old Red Cross nurse whose steady hands had once saved countless lives, but now trembled with apprehension about what awaited them in Allied captivity. The women represented a cross-section of German wartime society. There was Ingrid Hoffmann, a radio operator who had coordinated communications during the desperate withdrawal from Poland. Martha Weber, an auxiliary nurse who had tended wounded soldiers in makeshift field hospitals. Anna Richter, a civilian secretary who had been evacuated with military personnel as Soviet forces advanced. Each carried their own story of lost displacement and the growing realization that everything they had been told about the war was crumbling along with the Third Reich itself. For months, Nazi propaganda had painted terrifying pictures of Allied brutality toward German prisoners. Radio broadcasts from Berlin had warned that captured Germans would face starvation, torture, and systematic abuse at the hands of vengeful enemies. Stories circulated among refugees of mass executions, forced labor camps, and deliberate humiliation designed to break the German spirit. These narratives had taken deep root in the minds of civilians and military personnel alike, creating a pervasive atmosphere of dread about falling into Allied hands. The physical toll of their journey was evident in every face. Weeks of inadequate food had left the women gaunt and weak. Their clothing was torn and filthy from sleeping in bombed-out buildings and abandoned barns during the retreat. Many bore untreated injuries from air raids or accidents during the chaotic evacuation. Lice infestations were common, and several women showed signs of early malnutrition. The combination of physical exhaustion and psychological terror had created a group of human beings pushed to the very limits of endurance. As the trucks approached the processing camp, the women caught their first glimpse of their destination through gaps in the canvas. Rows of military tents and hastily constructed wooden barracks stretched across a muddy field surrounded by barbed wire fencing. Guard towers manned by Allied soldiers overlooked the compound, while military vehicles moved purposefully between buildings. The sight confirmed their worst fears about entering what appeared to be a prison designed to contain and control them completely. The camp itself was a temporary facility established by Allied forces to manage the enormous influx of German prisoners and displaced persons following the surrender. Military efficiency was evident everywhere, from the organized layout of buildings to the systematic movement of personnel. American, British, and French flags flew alongside each other, indicating the multinational nature of the operation. The facility had been designed to process thousands of individuals quickly, while maintaining security and preventing the spread of disease that posed a constant threat in post-war Europe. Processing began immediately upon arrival with military precision that left no room for confusion or delay. Each woman was assigned a number and required to provide basic identification information, including name, age, occupation, and place of origin. Military clerks recorded this data methodically, while interpreters helped bridge language barriers between the predominantly English-speaking staff and their German-speaking charges. Personal belongings were cataloged and stored with receipts provided to ensure items could be returned later, though many women had lost everything during their flight from the advancing Allied armies. The registration process revealed the diverse backgrounds of the captured women. Medical personnel like Greta had been serving with German military units providing care to wounded soldiers. Communication specialists had operated radio equipment maintaining contact between scattered German forces during the retreat. Civilian employees had worked in administrative roles supporting military operations or had simply been caught up in the mass evacuation of German personnel from occupied territories. Each story reflected the complex reality of total war, where the lines between military and civilian roles had become increasingly blurred. Throughout the initial processing, the women remained acutely aware of their vulnerability and the unknown intentions of their captors. Guards maintained professional distance while ensuring security, but their presence served as a constant reminder of the power dynamic that now governed every aspect of the prisoners' lives. The efficiency of the operation, while impressive, also felt impersonal and mechanical, adding to the sense that they had become mere numbers in a vast military machine designed to process human beings like cargo. The medical inspection order came without warning during the second day of processing, sending waves of panic through the group of German women. A British medical officer flanked by nurses announced through an interpreter that all prisoners would undergo mandatory health examinations requiring complete removal of clothing. The announcement was delivered matter-of-factly as a routine procedure, but its impact on the women was immediate and devastating. Years of propaganda about Allied intentions combined with their vulnerable position as prisoners created an atmosphere of terror that was almost palpable. The medical necessity behind this procedure was rooted in harsh wartime realities that the prisoners could not fully comprehend. Allied forces had encountered devastating disease outbreaks in liberated concentration camps, displaced person facilities, and prisoner-of-war compounds throughout Europe. Typhus spread by body lice had killed thousands in overcrowded conditions. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases posed constant threats to both prisoners and their captors. The systematic medical examination of all incoming prisoners had become standard protocol designed to identify and isolate potential disease carriers before they could infect entire populations. British and American military medical services had developed comprehensive procedures for handling large numbers of prisoners and displaced persons based on bitter experience gained throughout the war. These protocols emphasized rapid identification of health threats, immediate treatment of serious conditions, and systematic delousing procedures to prevent epidemic outbreaks. The requirement for complete undressing was not arbitrary cruelty, but medical necessity in an era before modern antibiotics, when infectious diseases could spread with lethal speed through crowded populations. For the German women, however, the order represented the realization of their deepest fears about Allied intentions. Nazi propaganda had specifically warned that captured German women would face sexual humiliation and abuse at the hands of enemy soldiers. The requirement to remove all clothing in the presence of Allied personnel seemed to confirm these warnings and triggered panic responses among women who had already endured weeks of trauma and displacement. Some began weeping openly, while others stood frozen in terror, unable to process what was being demanded of them. Greta Muller felt her stomach clench with fear as the implications of the order sank in. As a medical professional, she understood the theoretical necessity of health examinations, but her training had not prepared her for the psychological impact of being forced to undress as a prisoner of war. The power dynamic was overwhelming, and the potential for abuse seemed limitless. Around her, other women whispered prayers or held each other for comfort as they contemplated what might happen once they were completely vulnerable and defenseless. The reality that unfolded challenged every expectation the women had formed about their captors and their fate. British medical personnel, primarily female nurses and doctors, approached the examination process with clinical professionalism that immediately distinguished the procedure from the abuse the women had anticipated. Privacy screens were erected to shield individual examinations from unnecessary observation. Female medical staff conducted the actual physical examinations whenever possible, while male personnel remained outside the examination areas unless specifically required for medical reasons. The lead medical officer, Captain Sarah Morrison, a veteran Army nurse who had served in North Africa and Italy, took personal responsibility for ensuring the examinations were conducted with maximum dignity possible under the circumstances. She had witnessed the devastating effects of disease outbreaks in prisoner populations and understood both the medical necessity of thorough health screening and the psychological trauma that such procedures could inflict on vulnerable individuals. Her approach emphasized clear communication about what was happening and why, while maintaining strict professional boundaries throughout the process. Each woman was examined individually behind privacy screens that blocked the view of other prisoners and unnecessary personnel. The medical examination itself was thorough, but conducted with the same professional standards applied to Allied military personnel. Doctors checked for signs of infectious disease, malnutrition, injuries requiring treatment, and other health conditions that might need immediate attention. The process was efficient, but not rushed, allowing time for women to ask questions or express concerns about their health status. What shocked the German women most profoundly was not the clinical nature of the examination, but the genuine care and respect demonstrated by their captors. Clean blankets were provided immediately after each examination, along with disinfected clothing, to replace the contaminated garments they had worn during weeks of flight. Medical personnel offered reassuring words in basic German phrases they had learned specifically to communicate with prisoners. When serious health conditions were identified, treatment began immediately without regard for the women's status as enemy prisoners. Greta discovered during her examination that she was suffering from early stages of malnutrition and a respiratory infection that could have developed into pneumonia without treatment. The British doctor who examined her prescribed additional food rations and medication, while explaining through an interpreter exactly what was wrong and how it would be treated. The professional competence and genuine concern demonstrated by the medical staff contradicted everything she had been told to expect from Allied captors. The delousing procedure that followed the medical examinations provided another opportunity for the women to observe Allied attitudes toward prisoner welfare. Rather than the degrading process they had anticipated, the delousing was conducted systematically with attention to preserving dignity wherever possible. Clean shower facilities had been established specifically for this purpose, with adequate privacy and supplies of soap and disinfectant. Women were allowed to wash themselves thoroughly, while their clothing was being treated or replaced entirely with clean garments. The psychological impact of receiving clean clothing, after weeks of wearing the same filthy garments, was profound for women who had lost almost everything during their flight from advancing Allied forces. The simple act of putting on clean undergarments and dresses that had been properly disinfected restored a sense of basic human dignity that many had thought lost forever. Allied personnel had clearly anticipated this need and made provisions to ensure that prisoners received not just medical care but basic human necessities that acknowledged their fundamental humanity. Throughout the entire process, Allied medical personnel maintained professional boundaries while demonstrating genuine concern for prisoner welfare that went beyond minimum requirements. When women became emotional during examinations, medical staff provided comfort and reassurance rather than impatience or indifference. Language barriers were addressed through interpreters and basic German phrases that medical personnel had learned specifically to communicate with prisoners. The overall atmosphere was clinical but humane, reflecting military discipline, combined with genuine humanitarian concern. The contrast between expectation and reality created profound cognitive dissonance among the German women that would have lasting psychological effects. Everything they had been taught about Allied intentions toward German prisoners was being contradicted by direct personal experience. The professional competence and genuine humanity demonstrated by their captors challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of their enemies and the righteousness of the cause they had served. This psychological transformation would prove as significant as the medical care they received. Word of the humane treatment spread quickly among the women, creating a gradual shift in atmosphere from terror to cautious relief. Conversations that had previously focused on fears about abuse and starvation began to include observations about the professional conduct of Allied personnel and the adequate food rations being provided. While suspicion remained strong, the immediate evidence of their own eyes and experience began to undermine years of propaganda conditioning about Allied brutality toward German prisoners. The medical examinations revealed the extent of health problems among the captured women, reflecting the broader humanitarian crisis facing post-war Europe. Malnutrition was nearly universal, with many women having lost significant weight during weeks of inadequate food supplies. Untreated injuries from air raids and accidents during the retreat required immediate medical attention. Respiratory infections were common due to exposure and poor living conditions during the flight from advancing Allied forces. Several women showed signs of psychological trauma that would require ongoing care and attention. Allied medical personnel responded to these health challenges with the same professional standards they applied to treating their own military personnel. Adequate nutrition was provided immediately, with special dietary supplements for women suffering from severe malnutrition. Medications were dispensed for infections and other treatable conditions. Wounds were cleaned and properly dressed using medical supplies that were in short supply throughout war-torn Europe. The level of care provided contradicted Nazi propaganda claims that Allies would deliberately allow German prisoners to suffer and die from neglect. The broader context of Allied prisoner treatment policies reflected genuine commitment to maintaining humanitarian standards, even under difficult wartime conditions. Military commanders had received explicit instructions about proper treatment of prisoners based on Geneva Convention requirements and broader strategic considerations about post-war reconstruction. Treating prisoners humanely served multiple purposes, including gathering intelligence, maintaining discipline among Allied forces, and demonstrating moral superiority over Nazi methods of prisoner treatment. Captain Morrison and other medical personnel understood that their professional conduct was being observed not only by the German women under their care, but also by Allied military personnel who would carry these experiences forward into post-war reconstruction efforts. The example set in prisoner treatment would influence broader attitudes about German civilian populations and the possibilities for reconciliation between former enemies. Professional medical care provided to enemy prisoners demonstrated that Allied victory was based on moral as well as military superiority. The systematic nature of Allied prisoner processing reflected extensive planning and preparation for managing large numbers of German military and civilian personnel following the anticipated German surrender. Medical facilities had been established specifically to handle the health challenges posed by malnourished and disease-exposed prisoner populations. Personnel had been trained in proper procedures for maintaining both security and humanitarian standards. Supplies had been stockpiled to ensure adequate food, clothing, and medical care could be provided even under difficult logistical conditions. As the medical processing continued over several days, the German women began to observe other aspects of Allied prisoner management that contradicted their expectations about captivity. Food rations, while basic, were adequate and provided regularly without the starvation they had been warned to expect. Sleeping quarters were crowded but weatherproof with sufficient blankets to maintain basic comfort. Medical care continued to be provided for ongoing health needs without discrimination based on prisoner status. The overall system, while clearly designed to maintain security, also demonstrated genuine concern for prisoner welfare. The transformation in attitudes among the German women was gradual but unmistakable, as direct experience contradicted years of propaganda conditioning. Conversations began to include speculation about whether other aspects of Nazi propaganda about Allied intentions might also be false. If claims about prisoner treatment were so completely wrong, what about other assertions regarding Allied plans for post-war Germany or the nature of democratic societies? The psychological impact of humane treatment extended far beyond immediate physical care to challenge fundamental assumptions about the conflict they had been part of. Greta Miller found herself questioning not only her expectations about Allied treatment, but also her understanding of the war itself and the regime she had served. The professional competence and genuine humanity demonstrated by British medical personnel forced her to reconsider everything she had been taught about the character of Germany's enemies. If these people were capable of such decency toward prisoners who had recently been fighting against them, what did that suggest about the moral foundations of the opposing sides in the conflict? The individual stories that emerged during the medical processing revealed the complex human reality behind wartime propaganda and political abstractions. Women who had served as nurses discovered that their Allied counterparts shared similar professional values and commitment to healing regardless of nationality. Communication specialists found that Allied personnel were interested in their technical knowledge rather than seeking opportunities for revenge or humiliation. Civilian employees learned that their captors distinguished between Nazi ideology and ordinary German people caught up in circumstances beyond their control. The broader implications of humane prisoner treatment extended beyond immediate humanitarian concerns to encompass strategic considerations about post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. Allied commanders understood that the treatment of German prisoners would influence attitudes among German civilian populations and affect the possibilities for establishing stable democratic institutions in occupied Germany. Demonstrating that democratic societies could maintain moral standards even toward former enemies provided powerful evidence for the superiority of democratic values over totalitarian alternatives. The medical care provided to German women prisoners also reflected practical considerations about maintaining order and security within prisoner populations. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to attempt escapes or create disciplinary problems that would require additional security measures. Healthy prisoners could contribute more effectively to reconstruction efforts through supervised work programs. Humane treatment facilitated intelligence gathering as prisoners became more willing to provide information about German military capabilities and political conditions. The documentation of prisoner treatment procedures reflected Allied commitment to accountability and adherence to international legal standards even under wartime pressures. Medical records were maintained for each prisoner detailing health conditions, treatments provided, and ongoing care requirements. These records served both immediate medical purposes and longer-term documentation of compliance with Geneva Convention requirements regarding prisoner welfare. The systematic nature of record-keeping demonstrated that humane treatment was not accidental kindness, but deliberate policy implemented at the highest levels of Allied command. As the initial processing phase concluded, the German women faced the reality of extended captivity, with fundamentally altered expectations about their treatment and prospects for survival. The terror that had dominated their first days in Allied custody had been replaced by cautious optimism based on direct experience of professional, competent, and humane treatment. While uncertainty remained about their ultimate fate, the immediate evidence suggested that survival was not only possible, but likely under Allied administration. The psychological transformation experienced by these women would have lasting effects that extended far beyond their individual experiences, to influence broader German attitudes about the war and its aftermath. Their eventual return to German communities would carry with them first-hand testimony about Allied character and intentions that contradicted years of Nazi propaganda. This grassroots-level contradiction of official narratives would contribute to the broader process of denazification and democratization that characterized post-war German reconstruction. The legacy of humane prisoner treatment during the final phases of World War II demonstrated that maintaining moral standards during wartime was not only possible, but strategically advantageous for democratic societies. The professional conduct of Allied medical personnel toward German women prisoners provided concrete evidence that democratic values could survive the pressures of total war and serve as foundations for post-conflict reconstruction. The shocking reality experienced by these women was not the brutality they had been conditioned to expect, but the genuine humanity that characterized democratic societies even in their treatment of former enemies. The broader historical significance of these events lies in their demonstration that individual acts of professional competence and human decency could have profound political and social consequences that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. The medical care provided to 37 German women in a Bavarian processing camp contributed to the larger project of rebuilding European civilization on foundations of human dignity and international law. Their experience proved that even in the darkest circumstances of modern warfare, the principles of humanitarian treatment could be maintained and would ultimately serve the cause of lasting peace and reconciliation between former enemies. Thank you for watching this powerful story from history. If you found this account of courage and humanity during wartime as compelling as we did, please give this video a thumbs up to help us reach more people who appreciate real historical stories. If you're not already subscribed to our channel, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the untold stories of World War II and other pivotal moments in history. Your subscription helps us continue researching and bringing these important historical accounts to light. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Did this story change your perspective on wartime experiences? Do you have family stories from this period you'd like to share? Your engagement helps build a community of history enthusiasts who value authentic storytelling over sensationalism. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who appreciates well-researched historical content. Together, we can ensure these important stories of human dignity and resilience are never forgotten. Thanks again for being part of our historical journey, and we'll see you in the next video.